Ambassador Lucas Hart stood at the window of his transport vessel and watched the Galactic Council station grow larger as they approached it. The gleaming structure stretched across thousands of kilometers, a monument to alien engineering and power that made Earth's greatest achievements look like primitive toys. He had spent 14 years preparing for this moment. Since his selection as Earth's first official ambassador to the Galactic Council, he had studied languages, military tactics, diplomatic protocols, and the intricate politics of 100 alien species. His mother had given him a ring before he left, a simple band of white metal that had belonged to his family for generations. She told him it would remind him where he came from and what he was fighting for. Other passengers on the transport were various alien delegations and representatives from different species. Some looked at Lucas with curiosity, others with barely concealed disdain. He was human, a new addition to galactic society, and to most of these beings, humans were simply not impressive. The journey to the station took 6 hours. Lucas spent most of that time reviewing his notes and trying to calm his racing thoughts. His role was to advocate for Earth, to secure favorable trade agreements, and most importantly, to prevent humanity from being classified as a subordinate species that could be controlled or exploited by the more advanced civilizations in the Alliance. When the transport finally docked, Lucas gathered his belongings and prepared to disembark the moment his feet touched the station's floor. He felt the weight of responsibility pressed down on him. This was no longer a training exercise or a simulation. It was real. A tall figure approached him, a Krell ambassador named Commander Vex. His species was known for their biological manipulation abilities and their absolutely ruthless approach to military matters. The Krell had conquered 17 solar systems and considered themselves second only to the ancient Xylothian race in terms of power and influence. Commander Vex regarded Lucas with something between amusement and contempt. He told Lucas that he would be assigned to Observation Chamber 7, where the Council would evaluate humanity's potential. He made it clear that this was a formality, that no new species had ever successfully negotiated favorable terms with the Galactic Council, and that Lucas should prepare to accept whatever role the Council deemed appropriate for humans. Lucas wanted to argue, wanted to explain that humans possessed unique qualities and strengths that could not be measured by conventional metrics. But he understood enough about diplomatic protocol to know that this was not the moment for such declarations. He simply nodded and followed Commander Vex through the winding corridors of the station. The station was filled with sights that made Lucas's head spin. One corridor contained beings made entirely of crystalline structures that refracted light in impossible ways. In another section, Lucas observed creatures that seemed to be made of pure energy contained within force fields. A marketplace displayed technologies that humans would not develop for centuries. They arrived at Observation Chamber 7, a massive room with tiered seating overlooked a central podium where presentations would be made. Representatives from dozens of species were already seated, preparing to evaluate the newcomer from Earth. Lucas took his assigned position and tried to look confident, despite the knot of anxiety in his stomach. An ancient voice crackled through the translation systems, welcoming the Terran delegation and inviting them to present evidence of humanity's value to the galactic community. Lucas stood and approached the podium. His prepared speech was carefully crafted to emphasize human adaptability, our capacity for innovation, and our remarkable ability to thrive in harsh conditions. He discussed Earth's history of overcoming obstacles, our resilience through countless wars and disasters, and our drive to explore and understand the universe. Alien representatives listened politely, but Lucas could see their attention was elsewhere. Some were examining data on their personal devices. Others were communicating silently with their colleagues through means Lucas could not detect. He knew he was not making the impact he had hoped for when his presentation ended. There was polite applause but no questions. The session adjourned, and Lucas was escorted back to his quarters by a robotic guide. He felt disappointed and uncertain. He had given everything he could think of, but somehow it had not been enough. That evening, Lucas sat alone in his quarters and held the ring his mother had given him. He thought about her face the day he left Earth. She had seemed sad but also proud. She had told him something he had not fully understood at the time. She said that the real power of humanity was not something he could convince others of with words or facts. It was something that could only be revealed through action and presence. Lucas turned the ring over in his hands and wondered what his mother had meant. He was beginning to suspect that the next day would bring something unexpected. The ambassador knew that tomorrow was critical. Multiple species were sending representatives to speak before the council, and the decisions made would shape humanity's future for generations to come. He felt the weight of that responsibility settle on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. He placed the ring on his left hand and went to sleep that night with troubled dreams of vast alien cities and beings of incredible power studying him like he was an insect beneath a microscope. When morning came, Lucas woke to urgent messages on his communication system. A representative from Earth was arriving on an emergency diplomatic transport. Her name was Mrs. Chen Lin, and her credentials identified her as Earth's cultural and historical advisor. The council had requested her immediate presence for an unscheduled presentation. Lucas felt confused. Why would the council suddenly request a cultural historian when they had just listened to the official ambassador? Yesterday, they seemed uninterested in humanity's achievements or history. Now they wanted to hear from someone about Earth's culture. He made his way back to observation Chamber 7, wondering what would happen next. The answers were waiting for him, and they would change everything he thought he knew about humanity's place in the galaxy. Mrs. Lin had arrived while he was traveling to the chamber, and Lucas could see her standing in the preparation area. She was an elegant woman with silver hair and a quiet dignity that seemed to calm even the nervous energy around her. She wore simple Earth clothing, and on her left hand, Lucas could clearly see a ring identical to his own. He realized something then, something that made his pulse quicken and his mind race with possibilities. Mrs. Lin was not here by accident, and that ring was not a coincidence. Whatever was about to happen had been planned by someone, and Lucas had the sense that the next hours would reveal secrets about humanity that even he did not yet understand. The observation chamber fell silent when Mrs. Lin stepped forward to the podium. Her presence seemed to command attention in a way that Lucas could not quite explain. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had practiced this moment many times before. The council members shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward with renewed interest. The Krull commander, Vex, appeared puzzled, as if he had expected someone different, but could not articulate why. Mrs. Lin took position at the podium and began to speak. Her voice was clear and steady and carried through the chamber with perfect diction. She did not speak about human military capability. She did not discuss technological achievements or resource production. Instead, she told them a story about a woman named Margaret Chen who had survived the great wars of the 20th century. Margaret had been only 19 years old when she lost her entire family in a bombing. Her home was destroyed. Her parents were gone, and her two younger brothers had disappeared in the chaos. She could have given up. She could have accepted that life was over. But instead, she chose to continue. Margaret took work as a nurse in a refugee camp. She spent 14 hours a day caring for the injured and dying. She made no money. She received no recognition. She simply chose to help others because she believed that survival meant nothing if you could not preserve your humanity. While surviving years later, when the wars were finally over, Margaret met a man named David Lin. They fell in love and they married. On the day of her wedding, Margaret's grandmother gave her something precious, a ring that had been hidden and protected through every war and disaster. In their family history, the ring had been passed from mother to daughter for 200 years. Mrs. Lin held up her hand so the council could see the ring clearly. The simple white metal band caught the light, the small markings etched along its surface told stories of loss and continuation and determination. Margaret wore that ring every day for the rest of her life. When Margaret had a daughter, she told her the story. When that daughter had children, she told them the story. Mrs. Lin explained that she wore the same ring now, not because it had monetary value, but because it represented a promise that had survived everything the world could throw at it. The Krell commander seemed uncomfortable. He asked a direct question, asking what the relevance of this story was to galactic politics and civilization. Mrs. Lin responded that human strength could not be measured in the same way alien species measured their own power. She explained that humans did not survive difficult circumstances because they were engineered to do so. They did not have biological programming that created loyalty and obedience. Like many of the advanced species in the Galactic Council, humans had no genetic enhancement directing their choices and behaviors. Instead, humans created meaning. Humans created symbols. Humans remembered the Xylothian elder, who appeared to be approximately 4,000 years old, asked a complicated question. The elder inquired whether this sentimental attachment to objects was widespread among human populations or merely a cultural anomaly. Mrs. Lin explained that memory and meaning ran through all human societies in different forms, but the principle was universal. Humans would sacrifice everything for an idea. Humans would die for principles and for people and for promises made to those they would never meet. The chamber grew very quiet. The translation systems carried her words to beings who calculated strategic value through military might and genetic purity. They had no context for understanding why a woman would tell the story of a ring in a galactic council meeting. They had no framework for understanding why such a thing would matter. Lucas watched the reactions around the chamber, and he felt something shift. He saw fear in the expressions of the most powerful beings in the galaxy. They were afraid of something, but Lucas could not yet understand what that fear was directed toward. Mrs. Lin continued her presentation. She described how humans had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and famines. She explained that humans would rebuild civilization after any catastrophe because humans valued not just survival but meaning and legacy. She told them about human art and music and literature, how humans would create beauty in the darkest circumstances, how a human in despair could hear a song or read a poem and choose to continue living because of the beauty they perceived. She spoke about human family structures and how humans would sacrifice themselves to protect their children. She described how a human parent would face an entire army alone if it meant their child could escape to safety. She explained that this was not strategic calculation. This was not biological imperative. This was choice. The Krell commander interrupted and asked directly whether Mrs. Lin was claiming that humans were militarily superior to all other species. Mrs. Lin smiled slightly, and she said no. She said humans had inferior weapons and inferior technology, but she suggested that the council study the history of species that possessed human-like qualities. She invited the council to examine civilizations throughout history that had survived domination attempts. They would discover patterns. The species most difficult to conquer were not always the ones with the greatest military strength. The species that endured were those that understood how to create meaning, how to maintain hope, how to pass values and determination from one generation to the next. A crystalline being asked whether human emotional attachment impaired logical decision-making. Mrs. Lin responded that emotion and logic were not opposites. In human nature, humans could be logical about protecting those they loved. Humans could be emotionally committed to rational causes. Humans could examine facts and choose compassion anyway, because compassion was itself a logical choice. The presentation lasted 4 hours. Mrs. Lin told stories and answered questions. She discussed human history with patience and clarity. She never became defensive or arrogant. She simply presented human culture with pride and confidence. When finally the session ended, the council announced an immediate closed session. All ambassadors and representatives were asked to leave the chamber. Mrs. Lin approached Lucas as they were being ushered out, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. She leaned close and whispered that he should return to his quarters and wait. She said that everything was about to change. Lucas wanted to ask her what she meant, but protocol did not allow it. She had already moved away and was being escorted in a different direction. He felt confused and excited and terrified all at once. He returned to his quarters and tried to work, but his mind could not focus. He kept thinking about the ring on his hand and the ring on Mrs. Lin's hand. He thought about his mother telling him that humanity's real power could not be conveyed with words. He thought about Margaret Chen surviving the wars and choosing to help others anyway. Lucas understood that something significant had occurred in that chamber. Something had shifted in how the council regarded humanity, but he could not yet articulate what that something was. He waited through the long hours until evening came. His communication system remained silent. The station hummed with quiet activity. He was alone with his thoughts and his questions, and the simple white ring on his left hand that suddenly felt heavier than it had ever felt before. The next morning, Lucas received a summons to return to Observation Chamber 7. He was not sure if this was good or bad, but he had learned not to speculate. He simply prepared himself and made his way through the corridors of the station. The chamber was arranged differently than before. Additional seating had been added, and representatives from species Lucas had not seen yesterday were now present in the galleries. The Krell were there in greater numbers. The Xylothians occupied the highest tier. The crystalline beings filled an entire section reserved for their unique biological requirements. Commander Vex gestured for Lucas to sit in a prominent position near the council floor. This was unusual. Ambassadors were normally kept at a distance, but Lucas took the position without question. He noticed that Mrs. Lin was already seated in a separate observer section. The ancient voice announced that this session had been convened to address matters of critical importance to galactic security. The council had many questions regarding human civilization and human behavior. They requested that both the human ambassador and the cultural historian participate in a discussion. A Krell general stood and asked a direct question. He wanted to know if humans possessed any biological modifications that enhanced their cognitive or physical abilities. He wanted to understand what hidden advantages humans might possess. Mrs. Lin answered before Lucas could speak. She explained that humans had minimal genetic modifications. Their bodies were subject to the same limitations as many other species. They tired. They grew weak. They experienced pain and illness. Another council member asked whether humans had developed a hive mind or collective consciousness that enhanced their intelligence. Mrs. Lin responded that each human was an independent consciousness with individual will and individual desires. This created constant internal conflict and debate within human society. This was not efficient, but humans had learned that efficiency was not always the path to survival. The questions continued and grew increasingly specific. A Xylothian elder wanted to know the secret to human persistence. She asked why humans continued fighting even when defeat seemed inevitable. Mrs. Lin explained a concept that seemed difficult for the council to grasp. Humans created narratives about their struggles. These narratives helped humans find meaning in suffering. Humans would endure tremendous pain and hardship if they believed their suffering would benefit future generations. Different alien species asked whether all humans possessed the same commitment to meaning and legacy that Mrs. Lin was describing. She responded with honesty. She said no, not all humans understood this. Not all humans chose to embrace it. But the humans who did choose to embrace these values were nearly impossible to stop. The chamber fell silent. Then Commander Vex stood and he approached Mrs. Lin. He asked her, Very specific question. He asked about the ring on her hand. He demanded to know where it came from and what purpose it served. Mrs. Lin calmly explained that the ring was a family heirloom. It had been passed through her family line for over 200 years. Each woman who had worn it had faced different challenges and different suffering, but each had chosen to continue. Each had chosen to pass it forward to the next generation. Commander Vex asked if this ring possessed any technological significance. If it enhanced abilities or contained data, Mrs. Lin said, no, it was simply metal and meaning. She said that meaning was sometimes more powerful than any technology. The Crow General seemed agitated. He declared that meaning was sentiment, was emotion, was weakness. He insisted that creatures driven by emotion rather than logic were inferior and easily manipulated. He suggested that humans could be easily controlled through emotional manipulation. Mrs. Lin turned to face him directly. She said something that made every being in the chamber shift with discomfort. She said that humans were indeed driven partially by emotion, but humans possessed the unique ability to choose to do difficult things even when emotion opposed those choices. A human could love their family and still march toward their own death if the family required protection. She said this made humans not weak, but incomprehensibly strong. Lucas felt the tension in the chamber increase. He saw alien representatives conferring urgently with their colleagues through silent means. He watched the Krell command staff exchange communications that the translation systems could not decode. Another voice asked a question about human reproduction and family bonding. A Xylothian scientist wanted to understand how humans could form such strong emotional attachments to offspring. They explained that this created vulnerabilities. An enemy could threaten human children, and the human parent would surrender anything to protect them. Mrs. Lin agreed with this assessment. She said yes, humans would sacrifice everything for their children. This was true, but she suggested that perhaps the council was viewing this from the wrong perspective. She asked them to consider what would happen if all of humanity needed to be conquered. What would happen if humans were pushed into a corner with no escape and their children facing extermination? She posed a hypothetical. She said, imagine a species that would literally fight forever if their children were threatened. She said, imagine soldiers that could not be broken through pain or injury because they were fighting for the next generation. Imagine an entire civilization unified by the bonds of family and loyalty, passing from one person to the next through centuries. The chamber became very quiet. Crystalline entity asked whether Mrs. Lin was suggesting that human emotional attachment made them militarily superior. Mrs. Lin said, no. She was suggesting that this emotional attachment, combined with human adaptability and human intelligence, created something the galaxy had not encountered before. She was suggesting that humans could not be conquered in any permanent way, because humans would always find a reason to resist. Commander Vex stood suddenly. He declared that this session was concluded. He announced that the council would convene in closed session to discuss the implications of this new information. All observers were dismissed as representatives began leaving the chamber. Lucas stood, and he caught Mrs. Lin's eye across the room. She gave him the smallest nod, just barely visible. It was the nod of someone who knew exactly what she had just done and who understood the consequences that would follow. When Lucas returned to his quarters, he found a message waiting on his communication system. It was from Mrs. Lin. She requested that he meet her in a private meditation chamber within the hour. When he arrived at the small, quiet room, Mrs. Lin was already waiting. She turned to him and she smiled. She said that the most difficult part was complete. She said that the council was now afraid, and fear was the beginning of respect. Lucas asked her to explain what she had meant by all the talk of the ring and meaning and legacy. Mrs. Lin sat down and gestured for him to sit as well. She said that Earth had been observed for many years. The council had been trying to determine if humans were a threat or a resource. They measured by weapons and technology and genetic fitness. that they had been looking at the wrong thing. She explained that the ring was not special because of what it was made of. It was special because it represented a principle. The principle that humans would preserve what mattered to them across any distance and any time period that humans would choose suffering to maintain. Integrity, that humans would die for ideas and for promises and for love. Lucas sat across from Mrs. Lin in the quiet chamber, and his mind was racing with questions. He asked her directly how she had known what would happen in the chamber. How had she known that the council would react so strongly to the stories about the ring and family legacy? Mrs. Lin smiled and explained that she had studied galactic history for over 40 years. She had analyzed the rise and fall of every civilization that had achieved prominence in the known galaxy. She had looked for patterns and discovered something remarkable. The most stable and most difficult to conquer societies were those that possessed strong cultural memory and emotional bonding systems. She told Lucas that the ancient species that dominated the Galactic Council had achieved their power through technological superiority and genetic engineering. But something had been lost in that pursuit. They had optimized themselves so thoroughly that they had eliminated the very capacities that made growth and survival possible. They no longer formed meaningful bonds with future generations. They no longer created art or music because those things were inefficient. They no longer took risks because their existence was perfectly calculated. When Mrs. Lin had spoken about human capacity for meaning and sacrifice, she had revealed something that terrified the advanced species they had encountered. Humans who could not be conquered through conventional means, because humans fought not for individual survival, but for legacy and for family and for principle. Mrs. Lin explained that the Krell had been trying to understand humanity through a military lens. They wanted to know if humans could be defeated in battle. The answer from their perspective was yes. Of course, humans could be defeated. Their weapons were stronger. Their ships were faster. Their soldiers were more numerous. But the real question was whether Krell could maintain control once they conquered. She described a scenario where Krell attempted to occupy human territory. To ensure compliance, the Krell might threaten human families, but humans had shown throughout history that they would rebel rather than accept coexistence with those who threatened their children. They would organize resistance movements. They would pass information through generations. About oppression and injustice, Mrs. Lin told Lucas about the Vrethian civilization, which had been extinct for 3,000 years. The Vrethians had been powerful militarily, but they had made the mistake of occupying a human-like species. They had attempted to control that species through genetic modification and conditioning, but the occupied species had rebelled not because they could win, but because they valued their freedom and their identity more than they valued survival. The occupying Vrethians had eventually abandoned the effort. They found it took too many resources to maintain control of a population that would never truly submit. They learned that some species could not be conquered. The Vrethians eventually faded from galactic prominence, while the species they had tried to control survived and thrived. Mrs. Lin leaned forward, and she spoke with great intensity. She said that the council was beginning to understand that humans might be exactly like those species. Humans could not be controlled through conventional means because humans possess something the advanced species had engineered out of themselves. Lucas asked her what that something was. Mrs. Lin held up the ring on her hand, and she said it was everything. That ring represented love for family legacy passed through generations, the willingness to sacrifice, the creation of meaning, beauty, the drive to make the future better for those who would come after. She told Lucas that in every alien species represented on the Galactic Council, these capacities had been systematically removed. They had been viewed as evolutionary weaknesses that slowed progress. They had been eliminated through careful genetic engineering and cultural suppression. But humans had never undergone that kind of optimization. Humans were messy and inefficient and emotional and irrational. But humans were also flexible and resilient and driven by deep purpose. Humans could survive almost anything because they always had a reason to continue. The council was afraid Lucas because they recognized what humans represented. A living example of everything they had given up when they chose optimization over meaning. They saw in humans a capacity for survival and resilience that had no upper limit because it was driven not by programming, but by choice. Lucas began to understand. His mother had given him the ring not just as a family keepsake, but as a symbol of what he was fighting for. He was fighting for the right to maintain human identity and human values in a galaxy dominated by species that had forgotten those things. Mrs. Lin told him that the council would now have two options. First, they could attempt to eliminate humans before humans became too influential. But to do this, they would need to commit to total extinction, because short of that, humans would rebuild and resist and continue. They would tell their children stories about the resistance. They would create songs about the fallen. They would pass forward the memory of their independence. The second option was to accept humans as equals, to negotiate with humans as partners to grant humans a place of protection and respect in the galactic community. Mrs. Lin said that the council would choose the second option because they understood now what humans represented. They understood that attempting to control humans would be impossible, that the resource cost would be infinite, that the effort would never truly succeed. Lucas asked when the council would announce their decision. Mrs. Lin said she believed it would come within hours. She said that the alien representatives were likely consulting with their home worlds, with their leaders, with their historians. They were all coming to the same realization, she told Lucas something else, something that made him feel the full weight of what had occurred. She said that he was no longer just an ambassador. He was now a representative of a principle, a living embodiment of human resilience and meaning. He would need to carry that responsibility, not just for himself, but for the entire human species. When Lucas left the meditation chamber, he felt different than when he entered. He understood now why his mother had emphasized the ring. She had understood what many humans understood at some level, that humanity's greatest strength was not military or technological, but spiritual. He thought about all the humans on Earth going about their daily lives. They had no idea that their future had just been changed by a simple presentation about a family heirloom. They had no idea that their capacity for love and sacrifice and meaning had just impressed the most powerful beings in the galaxy. Lucas returned to his quarters, and he waited. Hours passed, and then his communication system chimed. An official message arrived from the Galactic Council. The council requested the presence of both Ambassador Lucas Hart and cultural historian Chen Lin for an emergency session. The message indicated that a major announcement would be made. Lucas dressed in his finest official attire, and he placed the ring on his left hand. He went to find Mrs. Lin, and together they made their way back to Observation Chamber 7. The chamber was filled beyond capacity. Representatives from dozens of species crowded the galleries and observation decks. Lucas had never seen so many aliens gathered in one place. The ancient voice of the council began to speak, and Lucas listened as his entire understanding of humanity's place in the galaxy shifted towards something far greater than he had ever imagined. The ancient voice of the Galactic Council began its formal announcement, and the entire chamber fell into complete silence. Even the Krell warriors seemed to understand that this moment carried profound significance. The council declared that humanity's classification status had been fundamentally altered. The Terran species was being granted full diplomatic status, matching that of the oldest and most respected civilizations in the galactic community. Additionally, the council announced that all star systems containing human populations would be placed under the protection of the Galactic Alliance. Any aggression against human territory would be considered an act of war against the entire council. Lucas felt his knees weaken. He had to grip the edge of his seat to keep from falling. The entire situation had transformed from humanity begging for basic recognition to humanity being declared a protected and respected member of Galactic Civilization. Commander Vex stood and announced that the Krell Military Command officially recognized humans as non-subordinate species, and that all Krell territories bordering human space would maintain peaceful borders. A Krell acknowledgement of human strength carried weight that Lucas could hardly comprehend. The Council went further. They announced that they were formally establishing a human representative to the Inner Council, a position that would give humanity a voice in all major galactic decisions. Mrs. Lin was being offered that position. Immediately, though, Lucas noted she had not yet accepted. When the formal announcements concluded, the Council opened the floor for questions and congratulations. From every corner of the chamber, alien representatives approached Lucas to speak. They were no longer dismissive. They were respectful. They were curious about human civilization and human values. A crystalline entity approached Lucas and asked how humanity had developed such unique capacities. Mrs. Lin answered before Lucas could speak. She explained that humanity had never needed to optimize itself for survival, because survival was something humans achieved through flexibility and social cooperation. Rather than relying on genetic engineering, humans had created tools and technology. And society, humans had learned to cooperate with others, even across differences. She told the assembled representatives that human history was filled with conflict and failure. But humans learned from failure. They created stories about their failures to ensure future generations would make better choices. This was what the ring represented. It represented learning and growth and the determination to create a better future, as Ilithian scholar wanted to understand whether human creativity came from a biological source or from cultural development. Mrs. Lin explained that humans were biologically capable of creating meaning, but that the actual creation of meaning was a cultural and social process. It was learned and taught and passed through families and communities. She described how human children learned values and history through storytelling, how humans created music and art, not because they were engineered to do so, but because creating beauty helped humans process difficult experiences and find hope in darkness. She explained that a human could hear a song composed hundreds of years ago and feel connected to the person who wrote it. This connection across time and across individual consciousness was profoundly human. Lucas noticed that the Krell were listening intently. Commander Vex seemed to be processing something difficult. The Krell had conquered through superior force, but they were beginning to understand that force alone could never have accomplished what Mrs. Lin was describing. When the formal session ended, Lucas was approached by the Council's chief arbiter, an ancient being whose form seemed to be mostly energy contained within a ceremonial structure. The arbiter spoke directly to Lucas. He said that the Council had made an error in their initial assessment of humanity. The error had been underestimating the power of what Mrs. Lin called human meaning-making. The arbiter explained that the Council had studied military capacity and genetic profiles and technological development, but they had ignored the historical records. The records showed that every civilization attempting to conquer a population similar to humans had failed, or succeeded only temporarily before collapse. The reason was that you could not engineer compliance in a species that refused to accept domination as inevitable. The arbiter said something that Lucas would never forget. He said that the most advanced species in the galaxy had all chosen the path of optimization and control, but in choosing that path, they had locked themselves into a single strategy, a single approach to problems. If that strategy failed, they had no capacity to adapt, and adaptation was perhaps the greatest strength in the universe. Lucas asked the arbiter whether the Council had decided to grant humanity protection because they feared what would happen if they did not. The arbiter seemed to smile, though his energy form made it difficult to be certain. He said that the Council had granted protection because they recognized a mirror. They saw in humanity something they had lost: flexibility, the ability to fail and learn, the willingness to take risks for ideals. the capacity to hope. Before Lucas could respond, the arbiter moved away to speak with other council members. The following hours were a blur of diplomatic pleasantries and negotiations. Minor details about trade agreements and cultural exchanges were finalized. Earth would be granted access to certain technologies. Humans would be welcome in galactic universities and research institutions. Human musicians and artists would be invited to share their work across the Alliance, but the most important achievement had already been secured. Humanity was safe. Humanity would not be subordinated or controlled or experimented upon. Humanity would maintain its independence. That evening, Lucas found Mrs. Lin in an observation deck looking out at the vast expanse of space and the countless worlds beyond. He thanked her for what she had done. She simply smiled and said that she had not done it for reward or recognition. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. She explained that she had understood something that many humans did not understand fully. Yet, in a galaxy of optimized species and calculated strategies, the most powerful thing was an optimized species driven by meaning and choice. Humans were not limited by programming. Humans could adapt and change and grow in ways the advanced species could not. She told Lucas that humanity's journey in galactic civilization was just beginning. The challenges ahead would be enormous. But humans had faced enormous challenges before and survived them through resilience and meaning and family, and the willingness to fight for something larger than oneself. Mrs. Lin held up the ring on her hand, and she told Lucas that this ring had survived wars and disasters and centuries of change. It had survived because humans chose to preserve it, because humans understood that meaning was worth preserving. She said that humanity would survive the challenges ahead for the same reason. Lucas looked at the ring on his own hand, and he understood completely. For the first time since arriving at the Galactic Council, he felt not fear, but certainty. He knew that humanity belonged among the stars. He knew that humans would face whatever challenges awaited, and that humans would not just survive, but would thrive. The next day, Lucas received a message from his mother. She had watched the announcement from Earth. She wrote to him about the pride she felt, not just in his achievement, but in what his presence meant for all of humanity. She wrote that the ring had chosen its bearer well, and that she hoped he would carry both its weight and its promise forward. Lucas held the message close, and he touched the ring on his left hand. He understood now that his mother had known something all along. She had known that the real power of the ring was not in the metal or the history, but in what it represented: a human choosing to carry forward meaning, a human choosing to believe in something greater than fear. He prepared for the work ahead, knowing that humanity's role in galactic civilization would be shaped by choices made in the coming years. He knew there would be those who wanted to exploit humanity or control it, or diminish it. But now he knew something the advanced species had discovered as well. Humans were not easily conquered. Humans were not easily controlled. Human meaning ran too deep. Human determination ran too strong. Human hope could not be eliminated. The ambassador from Earth stood alone in his quarters, with the ring catching the light, and he smiled. He was ready.